Okay. Okay, hello everyone. We just had a little bit of technical difficulties, so but we're ready and we're really excited about our talk tonight. So welcome to the August ACS SF San Francisco Bay Monthly Speaker Event. And as most of you know, we meet on the fourth Tuesday of the month. And I'm Susan Hopp, a board member, and I'm here with fellow board member Gail Koza. And for anyone new to the American Cetacean Society, ACS began in 1967 and is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and grants toward marine research. And regarding our grants, we are now accepting grant applications through a link on our website. So that's very exciting. And we really appreciate donations in support of our mission. They help us fund our grants and they support our expenses around these monthly talks. So to all of you who donate, a very big heartfelt thank you. So we are recording this session and we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. And after the presentation, we will do our best to get to them. And tonight we are heading up the Pacific Ocean to learn about a little known cetacean. Tonight's talk is Salish sea minke whales, insights from a 40-year study of photo ID. And our speaker tonight is Dr. Francis Robertson. Dr. Robertson is a wildlife biologist, marine mammal scientist based in the state of Washington. And she is currently the Marine Program Coordinator for San Juan County, home of the San Juan Islands in the far northwestern corner of Washington, located in the Salish Sea. And Francis has over a decade of marine mammal research experience, mostly focused on understanding the impacts of human activities on cetaceans. Her research has taken her from the Alaskan Arctic to British Columbia, Scotland, and her current base, the San Juan Islands in Washington State. Francis earned her PhD in 2014 from the University of British Columbia in the Marine Mammal Research Unit. Her doctoral research investigated the effects of seismic survey operations on bowhead whales in the Beaufort Sea. And in her work for the county, Francis leads the local government's efforts for the recovery of the endangered southern resident killer whale and manages numerous projects focused on reducing the impacts of vessel disturbance to the southern residents and other cetacean species. Her current research interests include the presence, foraging, ecology, and habitat selection of minke whales in the Salish Sea and historical whaling by Washington State coastal tribes. So we're in for an exciting evening of new learning about cetaceans. And with that, Frankie, thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
Right, good start there on mute. Thank you so much for having me this evening. Hopefully this will go swimmingly and this one will stay asleep. I have my 2-month-old with me right now, multitasking somewhat. But I am really excited to talk to you this evening about minke whales, and often overlooked and underappreciated species. And before I get started, I just wanted to touch a little bit on, this presentation, and indeed all of this work is dedicated to the late and great Dr. Jonathan Stern, who I'm sure many of you knew. He was quite active with the ACS broadly, and also with the San Francisco chapter, and of course has conducted much work on cetaceans in the San Francisco area and Monterey, as well as up here in the Salish Sea. So much of this work that I'm presenting this evening is John's work along with his colleagues, the late Eleanor Dorsey and Russ Hozel as well. And really, I would like to say that they were the pioneers of studying minke whales. So just as a bit of background to this study, it was the first photo ID study of minke whales anywhere, I believe anywhere in the world. And it allowed for this early recognition of these whales, allowed for the study of behavior and habitat use. And it's now the longest running catalog of minke whales. So the study began in 1980. It was begun by Eleanor Dorsey, and she was joined that summer by Russ Hozel and John Stern. I believe John was just out of undergrad and kind of looking for something to do, and one of his advisors sent him up to the Friday Harbor labs, and he found himself in this first study of minke whales and stuck with it. They conducted dedicated effort for 5 years from 1980 through 1984. And they supplemented this data with opportunistic encounters from researchers studying other cetaceans in the area. And these photographs from others were contributed from the years like 1977 all the way through to 2000. In the mid-2000s, John and Russ resumed fieldwork, and that's when I joined the project as well. And we conducted dedicated efforts during 2005 through 2008 and 2010 and 2011, mostly during the months of July and August. And again, since then, we have supplemented this data with the data and with sightings and photos collected from naturalists and researchers in the area also. So this has really allowed us to keep track and keep the project going, even though we may not be conducting dedicated field work. So how do you photo ID a minke whale? You know, these are animals, they don't fluke like humpback whales. They don't have saddle patches like killer whales. They're very elusive little whales. In short, to photo ID a minke whale, you have to have an inordinate amount of patience. As with other cetaceans, you know, you want to try and get parallel with them and snap away as the animal is surfacing, just hoping that your images are in focus and they're not backlit. Because it's quite challenging, even with good photographs, to identify these animals. So to identify these whales, we're using a combination of dorsal fin shape, nicks and notches in the fins, scars in the fin or on the flanks and back. And if we're lucky enough to have good enough photographs, also the chevron coloration patterns. And for those of you that aren't familiar with what chevrons are, these are this lighter coloration that sweeps up the flanks of these whales that you can see here in this illustration that Uko Gorta has put together. So what can photo ID tell us? Well, I'm sure many of you are probably aware of some of the types of things that ID can tell us. An obvious one is presence, which whales are present and how might this vary over time. But we can also use individual recognition to look at habitat use and distribution preferences. Are there places that individuals prefer? Are there specific habitat features that a group or individuals are associated with? How wide-ranging might these little whales be, especially here in the Salish Sea? And individual recognition can also provide insights into behavior. In this case, feeding preferences. For example, how do the whales feed and where are they feeding? What are they feeding on? And do they have individual preferences as to where and when they are feeding? So the early work conducted by John and Russ and Ellie in the 80s really enabled them to answer some of these questions. And it was pretty neat stuff that they found. So they were able to show that in the Salish Sea, and particularly here in the San Juans, which you could say the San Juans are essentially smack bang in the middle of the Salish Sea. And for those of you that, I wish I'd put a map up here of the whole Salish Sea, a little snippet, the Salish Sea really extends up north into the Strait of Georgia, down south, all the way through Puget Sound and out to the coast through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So you see the San Juan Islands here really are the epicenter of the Salish Sea. And so this is where they focused their studies, and they were able to determine that minkies here showed strong preferences for 3 specific areas, and they saw animals feeding in each of these areas. So these are depicted here by areas A, B, and C. And they found that individuals really preferred to stay in one area, and there was very little overlap or no overlap between areas by individuals. These areas were characterized by, for example, submerged banks that you see out here in the southern portions of the study area, or by deep channels and strong currents that we tend to see up inside the islands, particularly here in San Juan Channel in area B. And further north, this area was a deep basin area. And actually it became so predictable to see minke whales here that locals refer to it, they used to refer to it, and some still do, as Minky Lake. And if you wanted to see a minke, that is exactly where they would take you to find one. But so this early work really, it showed the first evidence of small-scale site fidelity in a baleen whale, and it was also the first report on small-scale non-overlapping ranges in a baleen whale, not just in minke whales, but in all baleen species. So that was pretty neat. Individual ID also allows for methods such as focal follows to be used. So this is a method where we're able to follow individual whales over a set amount of time. And it's really neat because it allows you to collect fine scale data on movement. So even with tag data, you're unlikely to be able to get every single surfacing of an animal. So in doing this, the team were able to find differences. They were able to show the difference between traveling and foraging. Foraging behavior, as I've shown here in this little diagram of surfacing events, is characterized by a series of seemingly random surfacing patterns. And this is in part why you need extreme patience to work with this species, because you never really know where it's going to surface next. This random surfacing strategy is in fact an adaptive search strategy that allows the whale to maximize the number of sites visited in a very limited area. So in short, it improves the whale's chance of finding food. We've also been able to get some very limited insight on individual range. And I'm going to throw out the caveat here that this is an N of 1. But in 2008, Cascadia and NOAA scientists were able to deploy a satellite tag to a whale that we've named Mum for various reasons in our catalog. Any of you familiar with John will know that the naming methods for these whales is somewhat different. So this tag provided movement data over a 6-week time period, if I'm remembering correctly. But what was so interesting was that it provided evidence that the whales are not only using the San Juans extensively. For example, this map here is showing locations taken over a 10-day period, and it's clearly showing these animals are using these parts of San Juan Channel here that I'm tracing with the marker, and down out to the southern sections to these bank areas, down to Smith Island right here. So they're clearly using greater ranges than previously thought. And even more interesting was that this whale was tracked all the way down into central Puget Sound to Bainbridge Island. So showing, much, much greater range within the Salish Sea, not just within the San Juan Islands. These early studies were also able to look specifically at foraging behaviors. We know minke whales here are feeding on small forage fish, and there are 3 species of forage fish that are prominent in the Salish Sea, those being juvenile herring, sand lance, and surf smelt. And we have some of the largest spawning areas for sand lance, I believe, in the Salish Sea. So it's quite significant. The San Juans are quite a significant place for forage fish. These individual focal follows and behavioral observations that they conducted back in the 80s established there were 2 distinctive types of feeding behavior that were utilized by minke whales. here in the San Juans. And these consisted of bird-associated feeding and independent lunge feeding. So the bird-associated feeding is when the prey is being concentrated into tight bait balls and trapped at the surface by diving birds and predatory fish, and there might even be seals in there. And then from the surface side, there are feeding gulls that are marking the spots and picking off fish where they can. And the whales, when they find these bait balls, will take advantage of them and lunge through them. And that's what you can see here in this top picture. And this is one of the rare instances where you will actually see part of the tail flukes of these whales. So the birds appear to be potentially attracting whales to these bait balls. And we think that this could be we think that the whales could be using passive acoustics to detect these active bait balls. And this is something that I'm really hoping one day to get out and look at, because it would be really interesting to know. And it has implications when you're thinking about how vessel presence and how noise, anthropogenic noise in the oceans could potentially be impacting an animal's ability to find food. Now, the independent lunge feeding behavior occurs when the prey is particularly patchy and predictable. And it tends to occur in these deeper basin areas, like I highlighted, where they occurred in the northern areas of the islands. And the whales will actively concentrate or herd the prey up to the surface by themselves and then lunge through it. And this is a great picture here of a minke lunging through a school of bait fish, and you can actually see all these little fish flying around the whale. However, we have observed changes in both foraging behaviors and foraging area use over the duration of this study. So in the 1980s, the individual whales were found to favor so one particular area, for example, area A, and they're found to share it with around 7 other whales. And they didn't, you wouldn't find whales from area A in area C, for example, and they had these different feeding behaviors depending on where they were. By the 1990s, foraging was only being observed down here in the south on the banks. And whales were no longer being encountered in these northern areas of the islands. And this change in use also coincided with a decline in herring in the region. By the 2000s, whales were once again being observed in all 3 areas, but were still most consistently encountered down here on the banks. I do want to highlight up here, when we were encountering whales in the northern end, it was no longer really here in Minky Lake. You remember that I mentioned that locals refer to this area as Minky Lake, but instead we were beginning to see minke whales up in this region, and they would be using current lines and the bathymetry in their foraging as well. So we're seeing some changes there. And just to shift gears a little bit, so this is the other really key part, and probably the more obvious of what you can get with photo ID data. Looking at individual presence, patterns, and insights into the population. So over the past year, I have been able to take a deeper dive into the project data, particularly for the last 15 years, and build a catalog on individual presence, as well as an ID guide. To do this, I've sorted through all the images collected during our dedicated field seasons, as well as those submitted by naturalists and other researchers over the years. So, these contributions by other researchers and by naturalists, whale watch captains, and members of the public are really, really important, especially when there is such limited work done on this species. I'm essentially the only person studying these minke whales right now, which is a little weird to say. And so the analysis stemming from this effort is in really early days. So you guys are the first to really see some of this stuff. but I am excited to share it with you this evening and compare it a little bit with what was found in the 1980s, 40 years ago. So this effort is really allowing us to take a closer look at patterns in who's using this region in terms of what segment of the population and what age classes may be here, how many individuals are using this area, and also look at patterns of presence over time and frequency of occurrence for individual animals. So in terms of demographics, who is coming to the Salish Sea to feed? So we've really been able to use a combination of photo ID data and also stranding records. And it's suggesting that this region is primarily utilized by females and young of the year. So young of the year are animals who've been born and weaned that year. Minke whales are a little different to many other species in that they're born in the month of February, and they're weaned by June. So stranding records dating back into the early 20th century show that the majority of minke whales that have stranded in the Puget Sound region have been females and occasionally calves. There have also been a handful of encounters of apparent mother-calf pairs by the whale watch tours early in the season. So this image up here is one of these images that was sent to us. This whale in the back is a whale that we've known for quite some time called Joan. And this one in front is a much smaller animal. So because we're not doing field work until the summer months, we would never see these apparent mother-calf pairs. So this is another reason that this is getting these kinds of data donated to us is really helpful. It is, however, not uncommon for us and others on the water here to see these much smaller whales during the summer. And this image at the bottom here was taken later in the summer, and it shows the adult whale that we've known as mum. And in the back, you'll see this much smaller animal. Now, this will be a young of the year animal, and this is an animal that we called Spud, I believe. So this is just a really great image to show you the size difference in these animals. The young of the year are only around 18 feet, while the adult whales are measuring in at around 24 feet or so. These young whales are also much more inquisitive of boats. So if you hear of boats being mugged by minkies, it's most likely that it's these younger naive whales. Also, over the last 15 years, NOAA have been able to opportunistically collect biopsy samples, and they've been able to do this from at least 5 individuals, and we know who these individuals are. One of them being this whale mum here. So she was biopsied just before she was satellite tagged. So we really hope to have these samples analyzed to determine the sex of these animals. So how many animals do use this region? So during the first decade of this study, and this was published by Eleanor Dorsey, Russ and John in the, let's see, it was International Whaling Commission Journal back in the late 80s. And they published this data and they provided data on 30 individual whales that they'd identified. And I've just thrown in 4 examples of these animals here. So far, the whales encountered over the last 15 years, we've identified 44 individuals, but I'll throw in the caveat that there are still a handful to be added here and that this is very much a work in progress. So as you'll see from those numbers, not very many animals. So over the first decade of the study in the 80s, the numbers of animals encountered each year was averaging in at about 10, with a minimum of 3 individuals encountered and a maximum of 19 animals being seen in a year. And unsurprisingly, the years with the most animals coincide with those that had dedicated research effort. So that I've highlighted here with this arrow from 1980 to 1984. Interestingly, when you skip forward a few decades, we are still finding that only on average 10 individual whales are encountered in a given year. And this may range from a minimum of 2 whales to a maximum of 20 whales. And while we don't see the same strong pattern of highest numbers of individuals during years with dedicated effort, in part because I suspect we have shorter field seasons in the 2000s and in the 80s, and for a number of other reasons, we do see that in years where southern resident killer whales were not around much, the numbers of individual whales seen, individual minke whales seen, was much higher. And this is likely because whale watch boats were spending much more time looking for minkies and other species to fill the void of southern resident killer whales. So these I've highlighted here. 2013 was really the first year that southern residents spent very little time around the San Juans. And over the last 3 years, we've seen increasingly that the southern residents have been spending less and less time here. We also see some similar patterns when we look at frequency of presence for individual whales over time. So during the first decade of this study, each animal was encountered in at least 1 year, while 1 animal was seen in 9 of the 10 years. And the average number of years that an individual whale was encountered during this period was 3.5 years. Over the past 15 years, individuals have been encountered again at least once per year, and for 1 individual in as many as 12 years. And on average, the number of years that an individual whale was encountered during this period was 3.7 years. So very little difference to early on. And these patterns are suggesting the minke whale use here in the Salish Sea has been relatively stable over the last 40 years, but with long-term use, but only by a limited number of animals. And this is just illustrating to you how I've been tracking individuals over time. So on the left here, we have, this is data I've transcribed from the early papers for the 30 individual whales. And over here, I have the whales, 44 whales that we have here in the San Juans. And you'll see this one here, whale number 3, which is actually, we know as Chrissy Hind, has been seen pretty consistently over the last 15 years. But perhaps most excitingly, I've been able to find evidence of long-term residency and longevity for these whales. So far, I've been able to match 2 individuals back to the 1980s, indicating that we have minke whales here in the Salish Sea that have been utilizing this region, at least during the spring, summer, and fall, for 40 years. So I'll be continuing this effort to match whales to those from the 1980s. And also, I'm hoping to work with NOAA scientists to use some new molecular techniques to analyze these, this small number of biopsy samples using these new methods that will enable us to estimate age. And because one of these whales that I've ID'd back to the 80s has been biopsied. So this animal here is Nick, today we know as Nick Jagger. And it was first encountered in, I believe, 1981, possibly 1980. So we do have a baseline to work with here, which is super exciting. And this is just another, the other individual that we know as Zeke. So this, and this really highlights, little is known about how long minke whales live. And this photo ID data provided by this longitudinal photo ID study may really help to fill that knowledge gap for this species. So just a brief conclusion for you all. This morning, this evening, see, I'm been working on this a while. So this evening, I've been able to highlight some of the insights that long-term photo ID data have been able to provide for a small population of minke whales here in the Pacific, in the Northeast Pacific. This is a non-intrusive means of data collection, and it's providing us with a much greater understanding on individual presence over time, on the residency of these animals, habitat preferences, foraging behavior, preferences, insights into movement and range, and even insights into demographics and age, and how some of this changes over time and what those changes might be in response to. So there is still much to learn from this population, such as I highlighted, there may be changes that have been happening in response to changes in forage fish abundance, and what is that tied to? Where do these animals go in winter and where do they breed? And what are the main threats and how can these be managed or minimized? And I think it's safe to say, you know, the minke whale could be seen as the canary in the coal mine for the Salish Sea. What can this animal tell us about the health of the Salish Sea? Because they are feeding on forage fish, and forage fish are really the basis of the ecosystem here. So having this 40-year-old data set is so valuable to try and help fill some of those gaps and to identify where we need to go next with our research. And so I'll just end there with some brief acknowledgements. Of course, John Stern and Russ Hazel, Eleanor Dorsey, who kicked off this study early on, volunteers from the 80s who I am still leaning on today, my friend Diane Dalrymple here, Bruce Stedman as well, and the photo IDs and movement data from Robin Baird at Cascadia, and then Candy Emmons and Brad Hansen at NOAA. And of course, many of these images and this data, particularly from the last 8 years, have been donated by enthusiastic naturalists and other whale folks up here, particularly Erin Gless and Aletha Leddy. So without them, we wouldn't have such a great 40-year data set. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
Fantastic.
Frankie. That's great.
Thank you, Frankie. We have a number of questions for you. First question is about passive acoustics. How do they hear, knowing that they are not echolocating? If you can talk about how they're hearing what's going on around them.
Oh my goodness. Makes me feel like I'm back in my comprehensive exam. So minke whales, like all cetacean species, are mammals, and they do rely on hearing. So they're not using echolocation like toothed whales to produce sound and to hear, but they're certainly could not operate without being able to hear signals in their environment. And they also are very vocal, though not particularly vocal up here. Minke whales in other parts of the world, and particularly probably on breeding grounds, are wonderfully vocal. So they do have an ability to hear. I do not know well enough to explain how exactly minke whales are hearing, but they, as all marine mammals, they do have very well developed hearing.
While we're on the topic of vocalizations and hearing for minke whales, I believe that there are throughout the Salish Sea a number of underwater live streaming audio devices to record the vocalizations of the whales in the area. Are you able to hear minke whale vocalizations on those recordings?
You know, that's a really interesting question. We haven't really been looking for them. I know that John and Russ tried in the 80s to record minke whale vocalizations, and they just weren't able, and they kind of made the assumption that minkies weren't vocalizing, which kind of does make sense up here, that they may not be vocalizing much because they also don't want to be attracting transient killer whales to their presence, particularly now with so many transients here in the Salish Sea right now. Puts me on edge all the time. Their colleagues up in Johnson Strait did recently publish a paper that suggested that they were able to detect some minke whale calls up there. So it is something that I'm interested in, and that every so often I prod my colleagues here who have acoustic devices out, if they could maybe take a look for any minke whale calls, but it's not something we've looked at specifically. So it's another one of those kind of, are they, aren't they, to look at.
Excellent. Thank you. To your knowledge, is there any formal ongoing study of minke whales in Pasa Maquadi Bay, the Bay of Fundy? The person who submitted the question says that the area is similar to Salish Sea, many minkies seen, and some with distinctive fins show up year after year. There's fidelity, but it's unclear who to share the data and images with.
So there was a long-running minke study over on the East Coast. I'd have to remind myself of who's working on it. I know there's one in the Gulf of St. Lawrence right now, and I have the contact details for that. The difference with the East Coast to the West Coast is they have far more whales out there. So being able to do the kind of work that we've been able to do with focal follows, etc., is probably much more challenging. Because we just have so few individuals here in the Salish Sea that it makes it possible to do this kind of work. But yes, there was a long-running project. I don't know if it is still running right now, but we can look into that and pass the information on.
Great. Are there any new leads on where the whales may be going when not in the Salish Sea and how far their range is?
This is a big area of unknown for us. So I know that in the early work, there were no matches between the Salish Sea and California. John always suspected that they were heading offshore, probably staying on the shelf break. But again, we really don't know. One of the things that I'm hoping to do starting possibly next year, but probably the year after, is to start getting out opportunistically throughout the year when conditions allow to put some effort in on the water to see if whales are here or not, and to get an understanding of when they start turning up and when they stay till in the year. Really, the best way to get this information is from satellite tag data, but trying to get them on whales as they're about to leave is probably very, very challenging. And the reality is there's really no funding for this species. This is a species that has never been hunted on this coast. They were never hunted commercially. There was maybe one or two taken by the macaw, more out of kind of, can I do it? Because they just weren't worth it, weren't worth the effort compared to the larger species. And, you know, so they're not considered threatened or endangered like their larger cousins, the blue whales or the fin whales, yet there's so few of these animals out on the coast. I think population estimates is currently sitting at around maybe 600 for the California, Oregon, Washington stock alone. And our work in the Salish Sea kind of reflects those small numbers in the small numbers that we see here on a regular basis.
And that relates to one of the other questions that we have, which is, are the Salish Sea minkies part of a larger stock? And do we have a good understanding of the minke stocks in Eastern North Pacific? You just mentioned the Washington, Oregon areas. Is there more that you'd like to mention about that?
So we really don't have a good understanding of the stock structure here on the coast and the population. We know that in other parts of the world, minke whale populations segregate by sex on their feeding grounds. And this is probably what's going on here as well. Like I mentioned, we suspect that we're seeing predominantly females and young of the year here in the Salish Sea. So where are the males? Are they the animals that are further north in Johnson Strait and Alaska? Because we do see animals returning to these regions on a consistent basis also. So yeah, there's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot of questions out there, and it's just trying to tie it all together on shoestring budgets and kind of on our own time is where we're at with this species.
Another good question. Has there been any matches made of the minkies that you've seen in the Salish Sea outside of the Salish Sea? So have they been re-identified outside of the Salish Sea?
There are some possible matches more recently with whales up in Johnson Strait. So that's really kind of the northern tip of the Salish Sea. But otherwise, you know, the effort in the 80s, they compared with animals seen in Johnson Strait, with the Salish Sea, and off Monterey Bay down in California, and had no matches between those areas.
Okay. Another question for you. Could you estimate the average and ultimate longevity, or what do you estimate the average and ultimate longevity of a Minke whale to be? You mentioned a few, or a couple, I think, that you identified over a period of 40 years, but what are your thinking?
Yeah, this is a good question. So I've chatted with a few folk, including Uko, about, you know, how old the Minkies get. Really, there's very little information out there. Whaling records suggest that maybe 50 years, but this is a really broad estimate. We really just don't know how long they do live. If they do live 50 years, then we're doing pretty well with these animals that are upwards of 40 years here. So that's kind of where we are. Like yeah, we think around 50, we just don't really know. So this is maybe some of the first data to help establish how old these animals are. And this is why it's kind of really exciting to be able to look at some of these new molecular techniques for aging these animals.
Excellent. Okay, we have lots of questions coming in. Let's see.
Oh,
more on
Ursula is on here actually, and she is the person who was doing the Minke research on the East Coast. So check out her question in the questions and answers. And yes, that should answer the question.
Yeah, so Ursula says, this was me studying Minke whales in the St. Lawrence estuary with a long-term data set started also in the late 70s by the late Ned Linus and his organization, ORES. I see a lot of similarities and differences from our Minkies to what you have presented and would love to exchange knowledge. Totally agree with what you are saying right now about missing funding, a big drawback on Minke whale research. Thank you, Ursula. Thanks for your work. Could you speak more about Minke whale breeding grounds migration? What do we know, if anything?
Not really. You know, we really don't know. For here in the Pacific, we really don't know. I want to say we just really don't know anything. You know, it's interesting when I look back at why, you know, we've got Minke whales here in the Salish Sea, and some of my work looking at the whaling activity of coastal tribes, and this is where this sort of ties in, these two research interests tie in, is there's very little sighting data for them on the outer coast. Whether this is because of conditions, it's unclear, but they certainly never turned up, and they rarely, if ever, turn up in middens on the East Coast, so they weren't on the West Coast, so they weren't hunted. There doesn't seem to be much evidence of stranding for them out on the outer coast if they're also not turning up in middens. They're small enough whales that their remains likely would have made it into middens. And interestingly, when you read back some of the ethnographical accounts from the likes of Scammon, you know, he provides descriptions of Minke whales specific to the Puget Sound region, and his descriptions are pretty much identical to what we see today for those animals. That doesn't give us much clue as to where they're going and where they're breeding, but it does give us some insight into the fact that these animals have clearly been using the Salish Sea over hundreds of years in a similar pattern to the way they're using it today. So they're naturally rare here, but and in other places along the coast where they're feeding, but where they go in between is who knows. So yeah, it's kind of amazing what we don't know about this whale species, for it being the most common whale species in the world.
Right.
very, very little.
Right. Another question, have you heard of any sightings of Nick Jagger in recent years?
I think I was looking back at the data, and the last one that I have specifically is from 2017. So it was he, she, definitely here in 2017. I haven't seen that whale specifically in the recent years data, but I keep my eyes peeled. So
Hopefully you'll see him again.
that would be great.
Yes. Okay, another question sort of related to Minkies, more about fish. Do you know anything about why bait balls are formed, how and why they're formed?
So it's when you've got a lot of predators that are acting together to help school a fish into really tight balls. So you'll have salmon, other predatory fish, dogfish, for example, that are kind of driving the fish together. And fish school as an anti-predator response. It's much safer to be in the center of a school of fish. So it's much safer to be in a tight ball than it is to be in a really diffuse, in a really kind of diffuse cloud of fish, if you want to say. So they're really, when there are predators that begin to start picking them off, they tend to school up much, much tighter into tighter balls. And the actions of those predators, those diving birds coming from underneath, those fish, sea lions, really drives them to school faster. And those animals, those predators are driving them up towards the surface, because when these fish are trapped at the surface, they've got nowhere else to go. So they're really stuck. And especially when you've then got feeding gulls, cormorants coming at them from the top, they're pretty stuck. So that's kind of how it works. There's some really great footage in like Blue Planet of schooling fish and how these animals will work together, particularly off South Africa. And you'll see then a Brutus whale coming up through the middle. And that's really the same thing that's happening out here with minkies, just on a slightly smaller scale.
Fascinating. Okay, another question about citizen science. When people see minke whales and capture photos of them, and they think those photos might be useful for ID, if they are in the general Salish Sea or maybe surrounding areas, is there someplace they can send those photos and maybe their location information? Is there a way for them to contribute as citizen scientists? Yes.
Yeah, no, please send photos right now. Just emailing me is the best way to do that. And I put my email on the front slide, and I'm not sure if you may not be able, if I put it in chat, they probably won't see it, right? Maybe if I put it in question.
I think if you put it in chat, people will see it, yes.
Okay, I'll stick my email here.
Put it into all panelists. Yeah, I'm sorry, to all panelists and attendees.
Yeah. Everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually I will have a new website set up for this work under a nonprofit that I'm starting to house this work. And so that's where I'll hopefully be able to collect the data through that website. But for now, please just email me. And I will say, when taking photos of minke whales, don't just send what you think is your best photo, send the whole series. Because what I find is often folk will send their best picture, but it might be slightly backlit, or it might be that particular individual has a scar that's a little bit further back on the whale, or a little bit further forward on the whale, that's obscured by water. So when we can get like a full surfacing series of that animal, and I know it's super challenging because I do it, it's really challenging, but any and all pictures of the animal can help identify it. So that's why it's a little slower to try and identify the whales that have been sent in from donated pictures when you're just working with one. And also the citing date and time and location is also really, really helpful as well.
Excellent. Let's see. What kinds of opportunities are there for an up-and-coming marine biologist to jump into the research, help with the study of minke whales in the Salish Sea?
Eventually, I hope I will be able to take on help. Right now, it's just the data's been in such a kind of, the state that the data's in, it's sort of more work for me to put something together for someone else to work on than just to sort of plod through myself. So that's why I've sort of just been going at it in what few spare hours I get on a weekend. But eventually, yes, I hope that we can get more interest, and I'm always, I'm always keen to help up and coming marine mammal biologists as well. So do get in touch, and I'm not always great at replying straight away. I'm a little busy these days. Running around upstairs. But I do try.
Excellent.
Tell me twice if need be.
Are there any plans to make a minke whale ID guide available to Salish Sea naturalists?
Yes, I'm close. I hoped it would be ready for this season, but it was not. It's pretty close to being done. As soon as I have my nonprofit set up, then I make it available through that for download probably. And also if people want a hard copy for a small fee. It's a lot of work to put this together, and I need some I need some help with fuel costs to get back out on the water. So
absolutely.
Yeah, so this just seems like a really great way to try and do that, because it's all being done on my own time, out of my love for this work. So, and I'm just so keen to keep this work going, because it really is a legacy. It's John's legacy, and I think it really deserves his work, and Ellie's work, and Russ's work deserves to get out there, and it deserves its recognition. Absolutely.
Excellent. Excellent. Ursula added a comment regarding the bait balls. So she said, this is one example of a difference to the St. Lawrence minke whales. There are no predator fish forming the schooling fish into bait balls. The concentrations of prey there are caused by environmental factors. Therefore, the minke's hunting behaviors are very different. So, interesting. I think that is all of the questions we've gathered at this point. All right. Any last, let me just check the Q&A. Multiple thank yous for this wonderful talk. It's been extremely informative and fascinating, just fascinating.
Hey, Gail, I just had a couple quick questions.
Yes.
Okay, so first, Frankie, you mentioned, I was curious about, we follow the killer whales or the orcas, and that they do go after, the young of gray whales. Mm-hmm. So, and you kind of touched on it, but do minke whales prey for orcas, or also known as killer whales?
Oh yeah, they probably are of the large cetacean species, they'd be the one that killer whales will go after the most, because they're the smallest. Okay. So they do, absolutely. And that's why I get a bit on edge when I see multiple groups of transient killer whales out on the banks off the southern end of San Juan Island. Because if they take out one minke whale, that's like 10% of the population right there.
Wow. Hmm. And you mentioned that they weren't hunted. Why do you think they were never hunted? I mean,
I think just because they were naturally rare, there weren't very many of them, and they're small. So, they were the last species for commercial whalers to go after regardless. And off the coast here, we were looking at predominantly the coastal whaling stations, and they were focused on the larger species, fin whales, sperm whales in particular. North Pacific right whales as well. And I think they were more concentrating on North Pacific right whales further up in Alaska. But I think it is in part due to the fact they're so rare and they're so unpredictable in where they're going to be unless you're in these regions like here in the Salish Sea. So,
got it. Interesting.
yeah.
And then, you know, to follow up on the work that you're doing in your role with San Juan County, I mean, what can you tell us about, you know, we know, especially down here in the Bay Area, that vessel ship strikes are a big problem, you know, for the whale mortality. And what are some of the things you're doing up there? Or, you know, maybe you can just kind of give us an update of your work.
Oh,
yeah.
I wish I had some, I wish I'd put some slides in at the end for this. So we're doing some really neat things up here. So, you know, for us, vessel disturbance is a really big factor in why southern residents are not doing great. You know, it's one of those cumulative impacts that they deal with. We're one of the premier boating destinations for recreational boaters in the US. Get a lot of boating traffic in the San Juans. We're also, we have major shipping, international shipping lanes running right by the islands up to Vancouver and down into Seattle. So we kind of have this, we have Navy operations out here, you know, you name it, we've got it. And, you know, so we're seeing disturbance from vessels in a number of ways in terms of presence and interfering with foraging, ability of whales to forage. Particularly, we know this for southern resident whales. I suspect it's probably also happening with minke whales based on research that's been conducted off Iceland with Icelandic minke whales. And then we have, you know, the ship strike issue, and we know that there have been strikes. Washington State ferries hit a humpback whale down in Puget Sound a couple of years ago, young humpback whale. We've seen it with other large vessels too. We're also seeing it with smaller vessels. There's at least one minke whale in our catalog that has evidence of ship strike. It seems to have lived, it's still going, Trotsky II. It's great, we see this whale every year. But I think it was back in 2016, this whale appeared with pretty severe injuries across its back. There's also been humpback whales here that have shown evidence of strikes, and these are with smaller vessels. And particularly in Johnson Strait, they've had a much larger issue with smaller recreational vessels colliding with humpback whales. As these larger baleen whales have recovered from whaling and reestablished in old feeding grounds where they were basically eradicated from through commercial whaling, boaters aren't familiar with how these large whales behave. They dive for much longer, they're much more unpredictable. So my colleagues up there with the Marine Education and Research Society and the, let's see if I can get this right, North Island Marine Mammal, not quite. Anyway, it's their group up there, the Marine Mammal group up in the North Island area. They created a social prompt, so a whale warning flag. But if you're in the presence of whales, you can raise this flag and it tells your fellow boaters the whales are in the area and you should slow down and proceed with caution. So we adopted the same flag here in the San Juan Islands to really try and address to address some of the issues regarding particularly recreational boaters and raising awareness and really making the boaters stewards of the whales themselves. So if you have a flag, you're a whale steward and you're telling your fellow boaters that there are whales out there and that they should be slowing down and proceeding with caution. And so we're in like the third year of that effort and really working with the state and federal agencies now to really pump out the flags and get them out to everyone. Most of the whale watch boats are using these flags, and they're actually using the flags to flag down recreational boaters that are at risk of speeding through whales. So those are, we're moving more towards this use of these social marketing methods to try and address this issue, particularly with smaller vessels.
That's great. That would be a really good future talk where we could get what you're doing and, you know, the efforts that are being done down here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And, you know, I don't know, maybe Monterey, other areas. I think it could be a really fun, fun talk.
I am happy to talk about whale warning flags and be whale wise and all that jazz. So
okay,
let me
good.
know.
We'll be back in touch for sure. So, wow. Well, this has been great.
Frankie, I did find one more question in the chat for you.
Sure.
Wondering if you know the best season to spot minke whales near the Channel Islands. You happen to know?
I do not know. That is a question for John. He would have known how to answer that. I'm afraid I don't. I don't really, I haven't conducted any work off California, and I'm not as in tune down there as I should be. But I do know some people who might be the best people to ask for that. So yeah. I'm sure Alyssa will know the answer to that question. So Alyssa Yaniger, yeah.
Yes, yes. Okay, I think, you know, there's some messages in here for you, Frankie. So if you have a few minutes to look at the Q&A in the chat, lots of people thanking you for your research and for this great presentation. So thank you again. This has been wonderful.
Great, well, thank you so much for having me.
I think we'll let you get back to that that growing future marine biologist.
Yes, my snoozing.
Oh, look at her. What's her name?
How cooperative.
She's her name is Ellery.
Ellery. Oh, well, she's
Beautiful.
been a very good audience member.
Yes.
Yes, thankfully.
Okay, well, thank you again. And everyone, we've got a really good talk coming up in September to honor Sharktober. So we'll see you at the end of September. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night. Thanks, Frankie.
Thank you so much.